On to political matters now. As the ANC continues to lose its spot as a political party of choice in different parts of the country, government of coalitions has had to step in to run those areas. But in most cases, as you've seen recently, those coalitions tend to collapse before even delivering any meaningful solutions to the people. As 2024 approaches, should we be worried that coalitions will not serve the people? Political analyst Ongama Mtika is here to help us unpack those. Ongama, thank you very much for your time this morning. And I suppose we could begin with that very question, that should we be worried that this idea of coalition governments is probably not the ideal situation for South Africa? And worse still, when we think about 2024 and the ANC's prospects, we could end up having a national coalition that could potentially be disastrous for the country.
Good morning, Rafia and your viewers. So it's interesting that coalitions are an outcome of a democratic process. And in terms of that, it reflects at any given time the aggregated preference of South Africans in terms of the political parties that are on offer. It will never reflect anything other than that. So people, when they go to the ballot box, what is foremost in their minds is which political party speaks to them and has potential to resolve their issues. That's the consequence of that which is otherwise an individual choice ends up in a coalition government is not a question of voter preference, but one that suggests that the political parties themselves are failing to convince voters that they should be given an outright majority. Indeed, people are rightly concerned about coalitions because the processes of decision-making under coalitions are a lot more cumbersome and longer compared to countries where you've got a majority party. However, who needs to convince South Africans again about the problems of majoritarianism? The South Africans have their lived reality has been one where they have seen what has happened, that power corrupts, and it corrupts absolutely, as the adage goes. So unfortunately, my sense is that at least in the next decade, we are going to be faced with coalitions, and what the emerging political system is will crystallize into will become clearer around 2029, when perhaps we might see consolidations or, in fact, further fragmentation. So coalitions are here to stay.
They're here to stay, Ongama, but just to add on to an earlier point that you've just made, the issue here is that decisions on the basic service delivery and the delivery of human rights to South Africans suffers because political parties are acting in self-interest and following their own agendas and not necessarily focusing on the biggest scheme, which is running the country. That in itself is a huge issue.
Absolutely. So one of the challenges with South African politics at the moment is the tendency, in fact, this is a problem of democracies, the tendency for representatives to want to act on the basis of their own self-interest rather than the greater good. Part of what has resulted in that is the fact that we've been under a dominant party system in terms of which political office translated to control of resources, a single-handed control of resources, whether it is in the form of a ward or a constituency or an MMC portfolio at a local government level, or even a ministerial position at provincial and national levels. What that did was to associate political office with the power to dispense benefits in society. Now, because our politicians have become fixated with that, they cannot envisage an environment in which that power has been conferred to a greater structure of a coalition, and one can no longer do with it what they could do under a majority or a dominant party system. I think that there's room for maturity where people recognize that, in fact, you are not going to have that power. And as a result of that, there may be greater, cooperation. Because the problem is not necessarily that, voters are delivering coalition governments. That it's more the fact that politicians are not maturing enough to realize that the whole is greater than its constitutive parts in a systems theoretic sense. And as such, one needs to play their role in humility and recognize that power is vested more in the coalition than in an individual.
Mm-hmm. And then when struggling to accomplish that, Ongama, they're also struggling to sort issues of infighting. I mean, we'll just make an example of what we saw within COPE earlier in the week. And then, of course, it's a story that we've seen resonate throughout the ANC, the DA. I don't know how they are able to focus on not only just what you say there and focusing on the interests of the broader public, but if there's a lack of unity, one supposes that may never actually happen.
These organizations have got humans operating them, and humans battle to keep a family together of 4 or 5. It would be a tall order to keep groups of unrelated people together. The only issue, though, is that there is a need for these political parties to recognize that, for example, at a local government level, there are ways to constitute government as a win-win, on a win-win basis, rather than the win-lose approach that they have been fixated in. In terms of the win-win approach, it's in the Act where government can be constituted by all the parties in council rather than just one group that mobilizes itself into a coalition versus another. When you do that, you don't eliminate potential conflict, but what you do is you eliminate a standoff between opposition and the governing coalition. You create an environment in which those who are in the executive, that is in the MMC and the mayor, become accountable collectively to a council that is diverse, that represents each one of the portfolios in the mayoral committee, but you have a greater sense of accountability precisely because you've dealt in council away with the standoff between one half of council being, the opposition and the other half being the governing coalition or governing party.
So, Ongama, with that, I want to look forward, if you could, maybe into your crystal ball, if you've got one. We would have thought traditionally that should we have a coalition, it would be made up of the 3 major parties in the country at the moment, that being the EFF, the ANC, as well as the DA. But what we've seen over the last few months or towards a year or so, powerful voices coming through from the Patriotic Alliance and the likes of Action SA. So what would a coalition in 2024, should we have one, look like?
That's interesting. My view is that the ANC has not undergone all the splinter processes that it should have by virtue of the divisions within the party. It would not be unthinkable if the party, after this December conference, goes through a process of not, if it does not splinter, but you have a splinter group that may want to find to express their political ambitions elsewhere, especially if the Motlanthe Electoral Committee is able to enforce the rules as far as who can run for office, and the idea that those who are nominated through a popular internal vote do not automatically become candidates for the national conference. If that happens, we will see another splinter in the ANC, and that affects the nature of coalitions that we are going to have. If that doesn't happen, the ANC and the Democratic Alliance remain the leading parties in terms of coalition formation. I do think that There may also be another centrist group or center-left group within the DA, offshoots from it that actually, form another political vehicle or join some of the existing groups, such as either Musimaimane's One South Africa movement, and push that towards party politics, or Action SA, or in fact, as Makashule Ghana has said, something new that may come up. So all of those variables affect what potential coalitions will be there come 2024.
Finally, Ongama, I must ask this as a young person, and you a young person yourself, you've seen the kind of leadership within these parties. Are you not frustrated by it and the fact that these are the very leaders that could be leading us post-2024, looking beyond the coalitions, the kind of leadership that currently exists? I don't know if it's deserving of running a South Africa of our generation.
In the ANC, and who is in the National Executive Committee and in Parliament and ministerial positions, my answer will be a resounding no. The relevance of these people has long gone. I think that many of them look at the rearview mirror and take pride in what they did in the 70s and the 80s. And we are in a time when we need people who want to look into the 2020s and say, this is what I'm going to do. And people who look at the 2010s and say, this is what I did privately or in an organization somewhere, and this is what I can take to contribute to building South Africa going forward. Many of them, the values that they hold are values of, wow, chief, where were you during the struggle, and all of those. That's just it's become toxic politics, which cannot be of service to South Africa going forward.
Thank you very much for your time this morning, Ongama Mtika, joining us there, political analyst, talking us through some of the issues that exist within South Africa's political landscape.